to do with this fact that if you're religiously a Jew, then you're ethnically a Jew. If you're ethnically a Jew, then you're ethnically a Jew. And I might want to convert, and that would be okay with Judaism, but I would have to become a Jew ethnically. Now that would be an artificiality, but still I would be considered ethnically Jewish. And if by the way, in Judaism, your ethnic identity passes through the matrilineal line. So, and that explains a lot too. I suppose I remember some years ago, I was in one of the biggest Judaica stores in the world in New York City, buying up stuff I couldn't get in Tennessee. Imagine that. And my wife was with me. She's blonde and tall, and I guess, especially when I had darker hair, I have been mistaken for a rabbinical student or a rabbi on occasion. And you could see all the clerks in the store. They would look at me, and the stuff I was buying, and they'd say, "Oh, young rabbi's, in from the sticks, stocking up." And then they'd look at my wife. Now, there's even a Yiddish term for a wife like that. It's a shitza. And it's not a nice word. It means a Gentile wife of a Jewish man. Which means if she doesn't convert, right, then all of those children are now not Jewish. Because ethnicity passes through the mother. And typically, even if she does convert, especially in the modern world, she never fully converts to the full culture, right? If you imagine marrying into a culture as foreign as you can, you would maybe accommodate and assimilate. But the mother is the one who teaches and passes on all and so, do you understand get the picture? And so there's a lot of, and in fact, the statistics show that when a Jewish son marries a Gentile woman, within a generation, the family's lost to Judaism. The statistics are high, 70, 80%. I don't know how to convey this fully, except to take several runs at it. If you imagine, it would be as though if you were to convert to Greek Orthodoxy as a religion, that would not mean that you would have to learn to be Greek necessarily. Are you following me?
Yes.
And in Judaism, you have to convert not just to the religion, but to the ethnicity. But that's okay. The tenor of the questions was, well, I think, why isn't Judaism, like Christianity and Islam, more evangelical, more interested in winning conversions? The rabbis, all the way back just after Jesus' day, discussed this. And they decided, one of the reasons I don't like this is because when the screen fades, it's gone. I have to touch it and I couldn't figure out how to make it stay on longer. Throw the big thing up against the wall after a while. Oh, the IT people at school say we're upgrading. And oh Lord God, now I'll never find it. Now all of my drivers will have to be reinstalled, and the printer will print it upside down, and all that. It's worse than reorganizing the grocery store. That cost me hours. The IT people say we're redoing it, cost me weeks, but never mind that. The rabbis classified a group of Gentiles, that's us, as God-fearers. And God-fearers, in the view of the Gentiles, gain nothing, see, by converting to Judaism. Because the obligations placed upon Israel were special obligations, in their view, designed to create a people who would bear witness to God's holiness and God's special character. You can believe in God, be righteous enough to go into the age to come, as the rabbis talk about it, without taking on those extra responsibilities. In the rabbinical view, Gentiles fall under the covenant with Noah, who is the ancestor of us all. And that covenant was about respect for life and, what you think of as, there were 7 provisions in that covenant as the rabbis delineated them. I don't see all 7 of them in it, but anyway, they're the basic. By the way, later on, when the question of whether you had to become a Jew before you could become a Christian arose in the early church, and they discussed that in the so-called Jerusalem Council, which is described in the book of Acts. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
James, the brother of our Lord, and those who were leading that council concluded that you do not have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian, but that Christians who don't become Jews first, or Christians who are not Jews, are still obligated to follow the provisions of the covenant with Noah. So that idea is pretty long-standing, even in the Christian church. Do everybody follow what I'm talking about? The stuff, all of the special provisions about fetlocks and phylacteries and all that kind of thing that you think of is very Jewish. The rabbis and the early church decided don't have to apply to Gentiles who have the right relationship with God. So, understanding things that way, there's no motivation for Jews to be evangelical. You follow what I'm talking about? They bear witness to God's moral claims on human life. They bear witness to the oneness of God. They bear witness by their very existence to the holy other character of God. Gentiles can see that witness, and without converting to Judaism, believe in one God, be ethically upstanding, all kind of things that are required in Judaism, and have the advantage of relationship with God without the burden. I mean, the rabbis see all that stuff that Jews have to do, as an extra burden. And when you think about it, it could be burdensome. Any questions about that? Please, yeah. Yes.
It's not exactly about that, but it's something I wanted to ask you.
Okay.
What percentage of modern Jews are religious?
Oh, not very many. We'll come to talk about that in a little bit. But that's another thing. Jew means both the ethnicity and the religion. And there are a lot of people who are ethnically Jew, but don't observe. That's the word to use in this context. They are not observant. Matter of fact, when you think of the statistics for the modern state of Israel are quite shocking. 90% of the Israeli Jews are not observant, or are observant in a kind of the way Christians who go to church on Christmas and Easter are observant. There's a lot of that, and in that sense, Jews are like modern Christians. Technically or nominally Jewish, yes.
So about 40 years ago, I was on a business trip with my boss, and he was Jewish.
Yeah.
And I used the word Jew.
Yeah.
And he was all over me.
Really?
Yes. And I said, well, what should I say? And he said, you should always say Jewish. If you say Jew, it's like a slap in the face, or using the N-word. So when you say Jew, sometimes I'm like, it feels like fingernails on a blackboard to me.
Yeah, see that.
I don't know if you've run into that sensitivity.
I haven't. I mean,
okay.
And I circulate. And, I'm an Old Testament professor, so you can imagine how many of my colleagues are Jewish. and I have never heard that.
Oh, okay.
But I can understand it.
Yeah, it was before political correctness, too.
Yeah, I can understand it. And I'll note it because I wouldn't want to accidentally
Right.
boo-boo.
There's someone right there.
What did you?
Well, the other question you had that came in was about lending money.
Oh, yeah, the usury question.
Usually, yeah.
The Old Testament says don't lend money to a fellow Israelite. And so, in the Middle Ages, they developed this really sort of, it was mutual hypocrisy on the part of the Catholic Church and Judaism. Since you can't lend to a fellow Israelite, that they defined that as you can't lend to someone in your own faith tradition, which meant that Christians could lend to Jews, and Jews could lend to Christians, and that everything works. Now you have a banking system, except the Jews were better at it, and that made Christians unhappy. Yes.
So what is the root of anti-Semitism?
No.
What was the
Why does anybody hate
What is the root of
Mormons,
anti-Semitism?
Baptists?
What is the root of anti-Semitism was the question.
What we were gonna learn that today.
You know, I don't know. I do know the kinds of things that have been, the charges leveled against Jews since 300 or so. And there is the famous Christ killer, right? Which I always thought was stupid because Pilate condemned him, you know, and the Romans nailed him to the cross, but never mind that. And it's also misunderstands that Jesus was Jewish and Paul was Jewish. Everybody was, all the early Christians were Jewish. We wouldn't have the New Testament without Jews. Every author except maybe Luke was Jewish. There's that, and then there's that, all of that blood libel stuff we talked about last week. You remember the using the baby's blood in the Passover bread, all this kind of. I think it boiled down to the kind of hatred that happens between siblings when they fall out over something common. We ought to feel a close kinship to Judaism, and I've been heavily influenced by a group of scholars who were at work about the time I was born, trying to reclaim the Jewishness of Jesus and of the New Testament and of Christianity. That's always influenced me heavily. As an Old Testament scholar, I'm always reading an Old Testament passage and thinking of where the New Testament picks up on that idea. But where people who read the New Testament only don't know the depth of what the New Testament says because they don't have the Old Testament text ringing in their ears as I do, so on and so forth. I'm not finished with this answer because there's more to it. And then there's that otherness, you know, part of being a Jew, especially if you're an Orthodox Jew. And you should understand, I'm wondering if we'll ever get to this now. We're trying to keep it alive. I'll revive it later.
If you, I might can do the settings if you're talking. It's up to you.
If you can do the settings.
Yeah,
do the
well, I need to keep it on longer.
Yeah,
Just
if you
open
can
it
do
up.
the settings, do the settings.
Open it
I'm
up
gonna have
for me,
to-
now, excuse me, I didn't.
I'm gonna have to break it up enough for you to get to that. Knock yourself out. What was I saying? Otherness, you know, if you've ever seen a Hasidic Jew, right?
Over there.
And you have, the Jews have always, you know, been peculiar looking and acting, from our standpoint, right? And along enough of that, plus there's always been this notion of, well, they're Jews, they ought to be able to recognize their own Messiah, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And it ends up, you add to that, they're better at banking over time, you know, and it builds animosities. Absolutely, to my mind, inhumane, irrational, unchristian animosities, but you can understand how they get started. Now, there were others. Let's see. I think you
I
probably
thought
know.
it had to do with they were considered the chosen people, which suggests that everyone else is not.
Yeah, of course, Christians also talk about ourselves as being chosen. And that's a misunderstanding, of course, of what Scripture is, and of how the Jews understand themselves. I already talked about that. They believe themselves to have been chosen to carry this extra burden, not chosen to salvation to the exclusion of others. And when you go back to Genesis 12, where the first statement of that chosenness takes place, and God calls Abraham and he says, Abraham, I'm going to do this for you, and this for you, and this for you, so that you can be the avenue of bringing blessing to all the families of the earth. So, it's like being mad at the Jews for being chosen to be, doctors and paramedics to keep us alive, or firefighters to keep us from burning, and all this language about light unto the Gentiles in Isaiah. That chosenness has to be understood in the proper way, and that's how the Israelites, the Jews, understand themselves as bearing witness. Right? That's the job they were chosen for. Now they popcorned, and I lost track of the sequence. Yes.
Coming back to the original question, what was it in the Old Testament that was the moral basis that suggested lending money within one's faith was not appropriate? Because
the moral justification is three statements of the law that says, you shall not lend money at interest. That's it right there.
okay, but I'm trying to the distinction. Trade was okay, frankincense,
Right.
myrrh, spices,
Right.
Lending money wasn't.
Well, I don't know exactly what the justification was in terms of economics, but I do know that those laws appear in a section of the covenant of the Torah, which is all about making sure you don't take advantage. Does that make sense? And I know that because I wrote an article on this, the standard interest rates among Israel's neighbors at the time were 20 and 30 and 40%, right? So borrowing, and you have to think about, you didn't borrow to build a house, and you didn't borrow to start a small business. You borrowed because your crops hadn't, come in well last year. And if you're going to borrow, and you probably borrowed, as many farmers do at the beginning of the growing season, so that you could have, seed to plant, since last year didn't go so well. At 20 or 30%, if you already had a bad, you see what, this is the road to absolute ruin. And the covenant is careful about that. That's why you have the year of Jubilee, or the Sabbath year, and all that kind of stuff. There's built into the Mosaic system a periodic opportunity to wipe the slate clean, give everybody a chance to start afresh if they've had some bad luck and so forth. But in the Middle Ages, they developed this theory that one of the words for interest in Hebrew, and it also happens to be a word Greek, means yield or produce, and it can apply to what tomatoes have on them after that kind of produce. And there was a medieval argument that money, if you plant it in the ground, money can't produce anything of itself, so that interest is unnatural. And in Roman Catholic, especially theology, anything unnatural is wrong. But that was after the fact, because the text simply says, no lending at interest.
You can lend without interest.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
Are they works or faith? Are they works or faith kind of people?
Who? No, heavens no. Heavens no. Heavens no. Because This is nothing, we get this from Paul, and from Paul through Augustine. This is another big discussion that's been going on in the last 30 years in scholarship amongst Christians and Jews. Paul sets up this, especially in Romans, this straw man who thinks you can be saved by works, right? No Jew who knew his theology, knew his Torah, in the history of humanity has ever felt that way, right? As though they could work to become the people of God. Because historically and otherwise, Israel is the people of God because God picked them in an act of gracious election, right? Go back to the Exodus from Egypt. Exodus chapter 2, verse going to be 15, 16, 17, somewhere along in there, toward the latter half of the chapter. Could be as late as 21. I don't know. God says, I hear the cries of the people of Israel and under their bondage, and I remember my promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So I'm going to deliver them. Everybody follow that? He didn't say, oh, Israel has been so righteous all this time they've been in Egypt that I owe them what they've earned. We know from other passages in Scripture that probably in the Egyptian period they had lost track of their monotheism and had begun to worship Egyptian gods. That's why when God calls Moses, Moses says, who do I say? God says, I'm going to deliver my people, and you're going to be the one who does it, through whom I do it. And Moses says, who do I tell them sent me? Right? So they had lost track, probably. Joshua 23 or 24, Joshua 23, I think it is. Yes. Joshua explains that Abraham and those people of that generation were idolaters, polytheists. So God calls people in the Old Testament, including Israel, especially Israel, not because they've earned it. The covenant is given, God brings them to Mount Sinai and says, okay, I've delivered you, you're my people, I've already called you through Abraham and the patriarchs. I would like to know if you'd like to take this relationship up a notch. Would you like to be, my peculiar people, a nation of priests? Right? Now, a priest is nothing, a nation of priests is nothing if they don't have a congregation. Do you follow me? And who would the congregation be? The rest of us. You see? So it's not, is everybody clear on that? Okay. And so now you keep the law because you're one of God's people, not in order to become one of God's people. And I would say that same thing about Christians on the discussion of faith and works. Paul was right. We do not work to earn our salvation. Paul was also right when he said in the Philippian letter, work out your salvation. That is to say, let that which God has put in you work its way out in your life, find expression, and that will be in what Paul called the fruits of the Spirit, and so on. So there's no contradiction in that understanding. I saw other hands. Yes?
Did you want to address Luther's?
Luther, bless his heart.
This is Reformation.
Yeah, well, that's what we're going to do. If we don't get around to it today, I'll modify the last lecture and we'll get around to it next.
I don't know to what extent we can attribute anti-Semitism to that, his position. I just don't know.
Well, I mean, we have seen, last week we have seen that anti-Semitism was alive and well by the 300s or 400s, and nothing happened much. There were occasional, even the Roman Catholic popes would occasionally say, back off the Jews a little bit, people, but they never did more than that, you know, you're being a little harsh. But that was about it. Anti-Semitism just flourished and continued to flourish until we know what, until yesterday. I mean, when has it stopped?
Yeah.
I think it's very, I'm just heartbroken about that whole thing. But it's, you know, it's still alive, I'm afraid. And it's irrational, all of those kind of things, but it still lives. And, oh, Luther, by the way, I'll say this now and then I won't have to say it when I do the lecture that's scheduled for today. Luther, bless his heart, he came out all salvation by faith and that by, you know, through grace and sola fide and sola scriptura and all that Protestant stuff. Until farmers said, well, that if we have a priesthood of believers, then that means even we poor farmers have the same status in God's eyes as the king. And there were farmer rebellions, and Luther wrote one of the most scathing, nasty, inhumane tracts against the farmer rebellion you could ever imagine. Sola Scriptura, so the Anabaptists and that wing of the Reformation, my spiritual ancestors said, well, we don't read anything in the Bible about baptizing adults, and it doesn't make any sense to us that you could be baptized before you believe. And out came Luther's pen, boy, and you know, and they were condemned to the fires of Hades. And you know, someone said, well, Jesus was a Jew and that sort of thing. We ought to treat people nice. Out came Luther's pen. Yes, everybody except the Jews. You know, so Luther had the impulse for which we should be grateful, but he was not willing in many cases to take his principles to their radical conclusions. When it started to have effect on society, he was very conservative. So, I mean, okay, that takes me out of the first 5 or 10 minutes of that lecture. Remember it next week, in which I say, you remember I stopped at 1492.
Yes.
Shortly thereafter, we're in the 1500s, that's the Reformation. We're all the product of the Reformation. We'd like to think that Calvin and Luther and those guys weren't anti-Semitic. Unfortunately, things continued until we come to the 19th century or thereabouts, and that's where most of the lecture for today, if I get to it, concentrates. Are there any more questions like this? Because these are important things to have and answers to, insofar as I know how to answer them. Okay.
I was successful in keeping your display
By poking at it?
up and running.
By
but
poking at
By
it.
poking at it, I was
Yeah.
not successful in setting, so I hope I've got you on the page.
Well, I know my way around this. Okay, so that's where we are. You won't be surprised to hear that that Jews were not happy with this situation. The Enlightenment comes along shortly after the Reformation, all part of a movement begun by the Italian Renaissance. And if you had courses in history or philosophy or literature or anything, you know what the Enlightenment was and how it worked. There was a little bit of opening up toward Jews, of all places in Germany. In the beginning of the 19th century, there was an edict issued by the Prussians called the Edict of Toleration, 1812. Toleration, notice, not liberation or emancipation, toleration. We can put up with Jews, right? And these are the circumstances under which we can do it. Well, some Jewish intellectuals, especially in Germany, influenced by the Enlightenment, started what is referred to as the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah. Their argument was, look, we're gonna have to do some things. We're gonna have to assimilate in some ways. We're gonna have to not seem so odd if we're ever gonna escape this sort of anti-Semitism and thing. Assimilate's a big word for kind of 4 movements. One, acculturation. You'll find Jews of that period. By the way, I bet you if you think back to, you know, the early 1900s, say 1920 or 1930, in your mind you have the picture of a German Jew, who may have been a banker or a lawyer or a scientist, who looked a lot like the rest of the Germans. Was the idea. They would acculturate. They would immerse themselves in the surrounding society. They would claim to be German Jews, German first, who happened to be Jewish in religion, not Jews in both ethnic and religious identity, which I've said to you is what Jewishness is. They decided, no, we will be French Jews or German Jews, and if France and Germany go to war with one another, I'll sign up in the German army, and you'll sign up in the French army, and we'll shoot at each other, right? Although we're both Jewish. So they said, we're going to claim our national identity over our ethnic and religious identity. There were movements to this Haskalah, this Jewish Enlightenment, included movements among some to, let me see here, what would I call it? Protestantize Jewish worship. The fruits of that are still alive today. Do you know the difference between an Orthodox, a conservative, or a Reformed Jewish congregation? Yeah. Do you? Anybody? Okay. We have. Is there an Orthodox congregation in our area?
Yes.
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 Who?
It's on Patterson Avenue.
It's Orthodox and not conservative?
There are two on Patterson Avenue.
Oh, there are?
Yeah.
Which one's the Orthodox?
Uh,
Oh, I know I know for sure where they're Orthodox.
yeah.
It's on Gaskins and River Road almost. Just across from
Yes,
the
that's-
church. That's a Lubavitcher
Yes.
congregation. They're certainly Orthodox. Orthodox, where the men will have the fetlocks and the points of the beard and phylacteries and prayer shawls and, you know, the whole schmear, and certainly keep kosher in their eating habits. A conservative Jew and a Reformed Jewish synagogue service will be entirely in Hebrew and Aramaic, except maybe for the homily. Right, except maybe for the homily. A conservative synagogue, there might be a tough, fetlock or two, but not so important. They will be observant in kosher. The service will be mostly in Hebrew and Aramaic. But they have decided that some of the requirements that the Orthodox would respect as being absolute for an observant Jew are cultural issues, and not absolutely essential, and so they've done away with it. Reformed Jews keep kosher on holidays, keep kosher in their heart year round. Do you follow what I'm saying? Most of you wouldn't tell that there. They have pipe organs in their synagogue. They don't sit separate by sex. They not only have bar mitzvahs but bat mitzvahs. Do you see what I'm talking about? It's very let's keep the impetus of Judaism alive, but we don't have to do those old-fashioned things. Right. That movement was begun as part of this Jewish Haskalah that I'm talking about, the Jewish Enlightenment. The hope was, if we assemble, by the way, it was centered in Germany and France. In the East, in Poland and the Eastern countries, the rabbis reacted against them and said, no, you can't do that. And there was born there, they called themselves the Hovevei Zion, the lovers of Zion, which was a movement, a membership movement. And they said, no, if you're Jewish, you can't assimilate. I mean, that is giving up on your idea. By the way, we began with a discussion about why is it that modern Judaism is so touchy about these things. You see why modern Judaism is so touchy about these things. This discussion goes back to the 1800s. Do we assimilate? And maybe the Gentiles will leave us the heck alone? Or do we have to hold on to all of our identity fully if we're going to continue to be the light to the Gentiles that God called us to be, if we're going to continue to be faithful to the covenant? And if you'll let that toss around in your head a while, ask yourself which kind of Jew you would have decided to be, you'll have an interesting thought experiment there. Well, so there was, especially in Germany and France, there was this big assimilation going on. And then 1881, there was what, and you studied this in history at some point, there was what's called the Dreyfus Affair. Do you remember that? A lieutenant in the French army who happened to be Jewish, right? And he had joined the French army, right? He was an assimilated Jew. Was falsely accused of being, and it is proven to be falsely accused of being a spy. Found guilty on very scanty evidence. The chief evidence was he's a Jew and can't be trusted. Right? Court-martialed. The novelist Émile Zola wrote a famous essay, J'accuse, in which he laid out the evidence for Dreyfus's innocence. There was a second court-martial, which found him guilty again, largely on the evidence that he was a Jew, so he couldn't be trusted. Finally, he was, by the way, pardoned by a French president in 1906. The Dreyfus Affair was very emblematic, but not the only such moment that convinced even the most intellectual and assimilated of European Jews. So people like Theodor Herzl, I don't know, you may have heard that name or not. No, well, I have. Because he's a big thinker. And he was an assimilated Jew, a philosopher. Phenomenology was his area. And he said, this is not working. The only way we Jews can ever be safe is if we have a homeland. We're talking now, we're down in the 1890s, okay? 1890s. Then there begins a bunch of things, and I have all the details, but I won't. You don't care about them anyway, and I don't want to keep that thing alive. I don't want to bother with it. I have dates and places, and you'd forget them by the time you got to lunch anyway. The 1880s and 1890s were a period of great ferment in these ways. There was a group of Jews who were having dinner together, Jewish intellectuals, assimilated Jews, in Vienna in October of 91. And they were talking about all these things. They said, well, if we're going to be a nation with a Jewish identity, now nation is the big nation, right? With a Jewish identity, ethnically Jewish, religiously Jewish, nation, then we need to speak Hebrew. Hebrew had been a spoken language since shortly after Jesus' day. And they agreed that they would never speak to each other except in Hebrew. And they discovered in the process that they were going to have to invent and alter the language because biblical Hebrew just wasn't working. But over the 1891 or thereabouts, what we now think of as Hebrew, which is a language spoken by millions, was revived and invented. There is no biblical word for university or streetcar or computer or airplane, right? Or political party or president. Do you see what they had to do? And so they just pretty much went about the process of reviving the language. This is all in the 1890s. was also the first of the official Aliyah, that's returns to Jerusalem, returns to Zion. Several thousand to tens of thousands of people went to Palestine. Now, this whole lecture series has to do with the Palestinian Arab and Israeli relationship. When that first Aliyah took place, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turks. And the Palestinian Arabs who lived in Israel at the time couldn't care less if a handful of Jews wanted to come live in the desert parts of Israel. Right? They even helped them out some, because those first returnees did exactly what you'd think they would do. They went to the parts of Israel which nobody was living in, and homesteaded, if you will. Right? That's when the kibbutz movement got started. And then we had the First World War. Oh boy. All sorts of things date, all sorts of the world's evils date to the outcome. The Treaty of Versailles, France and England in particular, the victors, decided they were going to divide the world up into mandates. Do you all know this business? The French got control of places like Indochina, we call it Vietnam. They had the English got the Middle East, right? Between the First World War and the Second World War, especially as the Second World War was winding up, getting ready to start, the British, and they had the mandate for the Middle East, the British were in conversation with the Hashemite sheriff of Mecca, who would become the first king of Jordan. All of the Jordanian kings are Hashemites, I like that word, and descended from this guy. Think now of Lawrence of Arabia, right? Because he was the intermediary in these discussions. The idea was we needed the Arabs in the Ottoman, by we, the Westerners, through the British. We needed the Arabs in the Ottoman Empire to be rebellious, because the Ottoman Empire aligned with our enemy. The enemy of our enemy, how does that go? And in order to get them to be that way, Lawrence of Arabia was a conduit for this. The British foreign minister promised them their own country after the war, or seemed to do so. In the Balfour Declaration, meanwhile, this same foreign minister was promising the prominent Jews leading this Zionist movement that the British would do everything they could to see to it that there was a Jewish state in Palestine. Now we're finally getting to the root of the modern animosity between Jew and Palestinian Arabs. And we can blame it on the British. Except the Americans said, yeah, it's fine, tell them what you want to. We need to win this war. And I'll fast forward to the UN Declaration 815, I think it is, declaring the formation of and a Palestinian state. The Declaration mentions both. And it included a map which has Israeli territory in the north, in Galilee, and a strip along the coast, and mostly in the Negev, and a big chunk here in the middle was to be the Palestinian state. Right? Now we're not talking ancient history. Y'all are all old enough to know what happened. What happened when that declaration was made? War. By the war, immediately. The Arab states surrounding said, okay, first of all, let's analyze what happened. The UN said, Israel can have this territory. Did they ask the Palestinians who were living there whether they were interested in giving that territory up? No. Did they ask the Palestinians who were living there how much they'd take for their land? No. Do you see? And I can just without going into details, there was a war. The Jordanians and the Syrians and the Egyptians in particular said, we're not gonna let you do this. Well, they did, and instead of following the map that was originally drawn, the Jews, the Israelis, captured a big chunk of what was supposed to be the Palestinian state. Then they had a war in 1967, what happened? The Israelis annexed a big chunk of what was left that was supposed to be the Palestinian state. And then there was the 72 war, and what happened? Israel annexed a big chunk of what was left that was supposed to be the Palestinian state. It's been 72 years since the UN promised the Palestinians their state too. What's happening now? It's in the news all the time. All the time. On the remaining little bits. What is the state of Israel doing? Building settlement. And the more that goes, now there's the problem of contiguity. There's a little chunk of land on the seacoast near Gaza, called the Gaza Strip. There's a little chunk in the Transjordan north of Israel, of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, and there's a little chunk up near the Golan Heights that could be Palestinian, but they don't connect with each other. It's hard to have a state if you're going to go from where you live to the capital to pay your taxes, if you have to cross 2 international borders to get there. It's going to be hard to do business transactions. It's going to be hard to have franchises. Do you see everything I'm saying? That's where we are today. And I submit to you that what happened was that we Westerners felt so guilty, especially for Hitler, that we wanted to make amends. And I applaud that, right? The Jewish sensibility, sense was that they needed their own, the only way they would ever be safe was to have their own nation. Okay, I got that too. So far, so good. But the problem of saying we are going to make up for what we've done historically, and then turn to the Palestinians and say, and guess what? You're very fortunate. You get to be the ones who do all the sacrificing. You get to contribute your land to this process. I might be a little angry. Might you be? Mm-hmm. Especially for 72 years. There are something like 115 UN resolutions that have to do with settlements, have to do with the establishment of a second state, that Israel, the state, modern state of, simply thumbs its nose at. How many did Saddam Hussein thumb his nose at before we launched a war? 2. Israel, 118, something like that. I forgot. I have a list off of them somewhere at home. And that's where we are. I would say the following. Anti-Semitism is awful. The Jewish notion of having a state's fine by me. It's not fine, however, by me, to select one group of people and tell them, you get to be the sacrificial goat. Right? I understand their anger quite well. Now my time's up. Passed up.
No, you got 1 minute.
All right. See, I squoze that whole thing in there. That did pretty well. Gave it a good squeeze and it got squoze. Yeah. Yes, please.
Who do you select if you don't select the Palestinians?
Well, see, that's a good question, but there was no debate about this. And there was no effort to take their interest. I mean, how would we feel if the UN decided to give, I mean, I'll have to, Alabama, I'm not, to give Richmond back to the Powhatan Indian and say, I don't care, this is their ancestral home, and we're not offering you a red cent, get the heck out of here. We wouldn't feel so good about that, would we?
But other borders changed after the war too.
Other borders changed, after which war?
Second World War.
Second
Oh,
World
yeah,
War.
oh gosh, well, yeah, we did a great thing.
Yeah, didn't we?
We created Yugoslavia for
Yeah.
created Iraq and Iran.
Yeah.
The French had Indochina. you all know that story. I mean, every one of those mandate things didn't work out. Every last one of them was a serious mistake. You know what I'm referring to, Indochina, Ho Chi Minh, French Indochina. Only, what was it? It was only 8 years before we got involved in Vietnam, before the French left it, right? So the French made a big old huge mess, and then we thought we'd come in and Europeanize things where the French couldn't, and you know the rest of the story, right? We created Iraq and Iran, where there hadn't been, you know, the Iraqi thing got started because, what's his face? I just said his name, Saddam Hussein, claimed that Kuwait was really a province of Iraq on historical grounds, and that the mandate had not divided it up right.
There's no winning or losing in these things. If you don't do anything, let's say you don't form Iraq and Iran, then people say, well, how come you don't help us out? And, you know, so the United States or the European countries are always, you know, in the middle. They try to do something they think is right, and it doesn't work out. But if they don't do anything, they're immediately condemned that way too. So it's really hard to, you know.
You know, maybe, but I'm not sure.
You know, because when the Iraqis, when we went into Iraq the first time, we didn't go into Iraq. We just got Kuwait and said, oh, you're liberated now, and we did nothing. And then for the next 8 years, people complained that, you know, maybe we should do something because Saddam Hussein is gassing its people and doing all kinds of things. And then when we did something, then people said, what did we do? We caused more of a mess. Well, I agree, but, you know, who knows what's right, you know?
Yes, yeah, but I'm gonna sneak around and alleviate American responsibility just a little bit, blame it on the French. Because, and I think it's true. I mean, Yugoslavia is a good example. Serbs, Croats don't get along, haven't historically. And after Second World War, Churchill and those guys decided, oh, let's put these little places all together and call it Yugoslavia, which is in Slavic, Pan-Slavia, right? Yeah, time's up, you need to go. And you know how it worked. As soon as the strong man was gone, those people who had hated each other for centuries, that little 40 or 50 year period of time when they had been kept in place by a strong man, when there was no strong man anymore, they went right back to what they've been doing for centuries before, hating each other. There are times when, well, I think the whole mandate system was Western European arrogance, to tell you the truth. I don't know why. They thought they had to take control of things in as far east as Vietnam. But they did. They were going to take care of the whole world. Right? Put it under control. Back to the main thing. If I were a Palestinian, I'd be mad. Right? And I think justifiably. Two wrongs don't make a right. That's what it boils down to. We needed to do something for the Jews. But in doing something for the Jews, we were very unjust to the Palestinians.
Who would you be mad at, the Jews or the British?
I'm mad at the British for talking out both sides of the house, out of their mouth. And I'm mad at everybody else since then for not helping the Palestinians to get a state when they could. Right?
But the people have tried, and they've let hate, you know, hate doesn't build. Okay, so they've been given a lot and they've not tried to build. And whereas you gave the Israelites something and they built something. Now, that's just an idea.
Except the Palestinians, the Israelis, by the way, Israelite is a biblical term.
Right.
Modern people are Israelis.
Israelis.
The Israelis don't let them. But anyway. That's the mess we're in.
Yeah.